Welcome everyone to this Economist Events webinar on the digital transformation of supply chains yesterday, today, tomorrow, sponsored by GEP. I'm Piotrowski, I'm the Economist business editor, and today we're going to discuss a topic of incredible importance and a topical one at that. Supply chain operations sit at the top of the business agenda. Their expanded role is largely due to the impact that increasingly regular and severe disruptions are having on many firms across a variety of industries. In 2021, the complex and interdependent supply chain landscapes we've come to take for granted have faced several big tests. The imperative for business is loud and clear. More than ever before, supply chains need to be technologically driven and digitally enabled to be resilient, flexible, and transparent. COVID-19 has made it excruciatingly clear that they need to be able to withstand the known unknowns as well as the unknown unknowns. At a company level, this will require better integrating operations and decision making. And that obviously requires a lot of careful deliberation and thought. And to share those thoughts and deliberations, I'm joined by a wonderful panel of experts. We have Mike Jette, who's Vice President of Consulting at GEP, Danny Antezana, who's Senior Director for the Global Supply Chain at Procter & Gamble, David Sheldon, Head of Global Supply Chain Development at Nestlé, and Dirk Holbach, who's Corporate Senior Vice President for the Global Supply Chain at Henkel's Laundry and Home Care business. Mike, I would like to start with you, just to set the stage a little bit. There's been a lot of worries voiced about the need to make supply chains more resilient in the face of all the disruptions that we've seen over the past 12 months, ranging from the pandemic to the Suez Canal blockage to geopolitical tensions between the West and China. I wonder, do you think that overall the supply chain has proved surprisingly resilient or surprisingly unresilient? And one way to frame that question would be, what would have happened if we had a similar confluence of disruptions, say 10 or 15 years ago? Would the supply chains have held up better or worse than they did in the past 12 months, do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I think that's a great question. I would say this is largely a good news story. I mean, we've all experienced some disruption in our lives, but if we had been together 14 or 15 months ago at the onset of the pandemic, if you had described all the changes to our lives, to travel, to the way business is done, and said, will you be able to get your consumer goods? Will you be able to get your services? Will your internet function in the same way? I think in general the feedback would have been people would have thought there would have been more disruption. So I think in general supply chains have performed pretty well. We have seen outages and shortages and disruptions, but I think it's a pretty positive story. And I think what is even more exciting is, going through the last 14 or 15 months, I think we've seen those things that help us react to this type of disruption. We've seen the mindsets, the technology, the way to approach the broader supply chain. And I think, companies and industries will be able to build off of those learnings and make a lot of progress so that, as disruption continues to happen, the response will be even more seamless.
So the interesting point is that, a lot of people have grumbled, politicians especially, that, that because of all the efficiency gains, and lean manufacturing, just-in-time delivery, that all of that has led to these incredibly tightly wound supply chains that are really, really vulnerable. And yet, from what you're saying, it sounds like, possibly 10 years ago, things would have looked possibly worse than they did in the past 12 months.
Yeah, I certainly think that's true. I think a couple of things that I think have helped us, and I'll be interested to hear some of my colleagues' thoughts. One is kind of visibility, better visibility into both our downstream and upstream supply chain partners, and kind of knowing where things have helped us respond more appropriately. The second is collaboration, right? So certainly it's gotten a lot easier. We have a lot better tools to collaborate. Now, in both of those areas, I think we're just starting to kind of harness some of the changes and the power that's out there. But I think visibility and collaboration are really the things that have improved over the last 10 years that I think have made it a fundamentally different experience than if we were going through this in 2010.
Danny, I would like to turn to you now and sort of, from your perch, I was wondering, what were the biggest surprises for you when it came to your supply chain, as the pandemic unfolded? The positive surprises, what were you afraid might break and didn't? And the sort of negative surprises in the sense of, where did you suddenly see problems where you perhaps weren't expecting them?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jan. I think the positive surprise was to see that it was not a complete, I would say, unexpected change, but I would say it was much more about accelerating the changes that were coming in, I would say, much more, I would say, relaxed pace. And the negative one was not seeing everyone fully at the same speed and the same stage for reaction. Just to give a clear example, was seeing the behaviors from consumers that suddenly started consuming vitamins like normal and regular, even consumers not even paying attention to this kind of products, suddenly consuming all kind of vitamins you can imagine. So seeing the demand being multiplied by 5, 6 from one day to another. So then the reaction was extremely critical to see that our whole chain was overreacting at a very, very, I would say, high speed.
And could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because that's interesting. I mean, obviously, the one example that comes to my mind permanently when I think of similar situations is the sudden rush for toilet paper, which is sort of always slightly beyond me. It is not a basic necessity. There are other ways to deal with the problem that toilet paper is meant to tackle. And yet you had these, stampedes for loo roll around the world. And was that for vitamins? Was that a spike that was sort of short-lived, or was it something that really, that really caused a ripple effect down the supply chain and caused you to think a little bit more deeply about a reconfiguration as opposed to, just, being a short-term problem, in which case some people, left the shop without their vitamins? Mm-hmm. How persistent was that problem?
Yeah, healthcare in general has presented a very interesting trend. So people thinking about how to get protected, how to increase defenses, and of course there was an immediate response to the COVID with the unknown. What could happen? Everybody started rushing and trying to get as much as vitamin C, vitamin D, and even painkillers without even knowing that they would be needed. Everybody started running. Exactly as you mentioned for the toilet papers. So there are good and bad things about it. I think the good thing is that you see people trying to get somehow, I would say, help through increased defenses, better products, better quality products, because they really cared about this kind of I would say environment. Another good example, just making an extension about cleaning products. So if you are trying to get really stronger from something that is unknown, you don't want to get a cheap product to clean your house or where your family is living. You want to get the best product available in the market. So you see a huge, well-known branded products seeing the demand going up the sky. In the other angle, you see also an exaggeration because it's not a real demand. I can tell you that this huge peak in products like toilet paper are now back to normal, and because people ended up with 6 months of toilet paper inventory at home, and there's no more room
That's
for
very
that.
interesting. Yeah. Speaking of clean products, Dirk, so could you tell us about the experience of Henkel? Obviously, there was an uptick in demand, especially early on in the pandemic. I know that my parents, for certain, they started washing their clothes much more often than in the past. Basically, I visited them briefly, sort of midway through the pandemic, in the early autumn, and at home, I sort of, I would change clothes when I came back from the outdoors, but they just basically took my clothes and told me to change and washed them immediately. So I presume that there was some reconfiguration of demand for some of your products. Um, what did you see and what did you do to change and to adapt?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we saw different developments. So when it comes to these demand spikes, Danny referred to, of course, we saw that also, but very much contingent to the different markets. So depending on the COVID, let's say I would call deployment and development. Of course, Asia much earlier than Europe, and then it really went over to North America. So here, I think that was one thing. So you had these extreme peaks for a relatively short period of time all over the globe in different markets at different times. And then within our portfolio, of course, we have laundry products and home care. So here also differentiated development in the categories. So the peak buying happened more or less in all categories. But then, of course, over time, you saw a stronger differentiation within home care. Anything with a higher disinfection properties, of course, was very strong in demand. Then you had products like dishwashing, high demand and continuously high demand, by the way, that continues until today, because people are in many geographies still more at home than before, obviously cooking at home and so on. And laundry, as I said, quite a strong growth last year, but we saw also here a normalization because at the end of the day, let's say, people do not wash per se more. I think your example was correct for a certain period of time. We rather see the opposite. So people staying at home, they wash tendentially less. So when you look at market growth Nielsen data, you see this especially over the last periods, rather contraction of the market. So here, again, the message is very differentiated development. And of course, the challenge for us in the supply chain was, although we are pretty much locally sourcing for local sales, still to get that all over each other, especially, of course, during the very hot period, Q1, Q2 last year.
So that's interesting. And can I ask, when you are thinking, when you're at the time when you saw these spikes, how were you thinking about whether or not you actually do need to just brace and wait it out, or whether you actually do need to reconfigure something? How do you make those decisions? How do you make those projections about consumer behavior and the capacity of the supply chain in order to ensure the least disruption possible to consumers at the end?
Yeah, very good question. So I think you're also differentiated by category. Of course, first of all, let's say a system can only respond to, let's say, unless you have probably too much capacity, which is also not very sustainable and sufficient, to a certain degree of a, let's say, an increase in a certain period of time. So here, I think, of course, you live off what you have in inventory. And by the way, the other challenge was last year. Our first priority always was protecting our people. So that means tendentially you reduce your manufacturing output, at least short term, because you have no shift handovers anymore, separate A teams, B teams, and so here that was the challenge. So you try to cover what you can in the first shock, the first few weeks, and then we tried to anticipate in our portfolio, as I said, laundry, probably a peak, but not really substantially, structurally, a much higher inflated demand. Whereas in for instance, dishwashing, we did some capacity adjustments. And then, of course, we had other products, which is not the main part of our business, but some really pure disinfection products. There we started very quickly adding incremental capacity, also in terms of assets. So investing into bottle blowing and in order to be able to cater here for a longer period of time with an elevated demand. I think that were thoughts and actions in Q2, Q3 last year.
And then were your projections basically right, or did you over underestimate some of the movements that you were anticipating?
Yeah, I think every forecast by definition is first of all wrong. So that is, I think, one of the basic things. So you need to be prepared for the worst. But I think in essence, I would say yes. Yeah, because I mentioned before, laundry is look at the Nielsen data, it's public. Yeah, is maximum flat or partially even negative. The markets. Dishwashing is remaining on an elevated level. And of course, when it comes to a product like chlorine bleach, of course, we are away from the super peaks where you had 2, 3, 4 times the normal demand. That is not the case anymore, but still an elevated usage. So I think overall, that was not, we were not so wrong, I would say. Although, of course, in the markets, again, you have always different dynamics. So some markets we were performing very well. So we, within 2-3 months, were back on fill rates close to the 100, so 98, 99. Other markets, we struggled much longer. And here, I think one thing you said, what were the surprises in your earlier question? Also, let's say I wouldn't call it the negative surprises, but in these kind of stress situations, you find out very quickly in which countries and geographies you have really good teams, and in others where you still need to work on. Yeah, so I think that is definitely also a learning out of this situation.
So that's actually a question that leads me to a question that I was going to ask David, and that's how is your supply chain or your thinking about supply chains different now to what it was 14 months ago? What has changed?
Yeah. The whole period was a supply chain anthropologist's dream, really, on both the demand and the supply side. Because you realize, it's an old joke from about 50 years ago, you're only ever 10 days away from the Stone Age, economists tell me. And you get a sense of where you saw some of those images that was on the evening news of empty shelves and so on, of how quickly it can go wrong. However, what I was trying to reassure everybody who would listen was, if people, consumers, shoppers, people like us, behaved normally, it would have been okay. I guarantee it would have been okay. I mean, to the outside, the modern 21st century consumer packaged goods supply chain is as effective as the Star Trek replicator to most people. As soon as something goes wrong with it, then it becomes very obvious that it's a little bit more complicated than everything's there all the time. It isn't like that in every market, don't misunderstand me. But it's very interesting. I think that was a wake-up call, would be wrong, because as a consumer-centric business, you always want to think, what does this mean for the consumer? Back to your very first thing you said about, would it be different 10 years ago? What I would say was that what worked very well for a company like ours, very international, operations across 70, 80 plus markets, was the early experiences of our colleagues in China. And just having that, let's get China on the phone in the middle of January to talk about what's happening and how they're responding. And then how would that play out across some different categories and in different markets? So in some ways, having old-fashioned people on the ground, as it were, was a positive in that aspect. So that just coming back to that point, and I think what else has changed, and again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I think the supply chain relearned the value of the right inventory in the right place at the right time. Now, yes, we're on a long-term journey of reducing inventory and waste across the supply chain. However, stock is very useful. Safety stock is very useful for unexpected events, and we had the big bang of unexpected events. Although, of course, looking back now, you could say, yeah, why didn't we predict a global pandemic? Well, we didn't. So there's a few things that make you stop and rethink. But I would also, so hopefully that answers what do I think's changed. I think, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, and I think we in the supply chain has been running a marathon for decades now about improvements and flexibility. And I think the past 12 months, we actually did it was almost like a record-breaking 400 meters lap of the track in terms of changes to how consumers shop and the way they buy, and also changes about the way we think how the supply chain needs to operate internally and externally. So I think they're just some of the key things for me over the past 12 months. And I want to echo what Dirk said as well. Again, it appears to most people who walk into a supermarket, the Star Trek replicator machine works every day. It requires a lot of people to make that magic happen, in truck drivers, in factories and distribution centers and so on. So to have to manage such a change in demand with impacts on our ability to supply was very impressive across the industry. Final thing on that, I also give kudos to some governmental actions here. We work in the food industry, so we could rightly say, can we have permission, could we get permission for our suppliers to make deliveries and to do things a little bit differently to help keep the supply chain going as well. So I think you have to look at this from all sides. What can you do? What can your suppliers do? And also, how can we make the system a little bit easier to navigate when we're under such pressure?
That's very interesting. So I would like to maybe go back to Danny for a moment and ask about the sort of technology that you have found particularly useful during this disruption, and what sort of technology do you see coming down the pike that might help even more? And how are you thinking about making, using supply chain technologies of, I see a cottage industry of specialized consultancies cropping up in the past, not in the past year, but in the past few years, which seem to be, directly offering technological solutions to manage supply chains. Do you find them useful, or is it really a matter of having people on the ground, as we just heard?
Yeah, and well, we haven't developed any new technology because of that. So we basically utilized all the platforms we had before. I think the big change here is about technologies will help you if you have a background, if you have reliable data to project things based on that. So the thing is that the data was completely obsolete. From one day to another, the data was no longer valid. So we had to build something from scratch and trying to predict something unpredictable. So there wouldn't have any specific way, any crystal ball saying that the specific demand, as I mentioned before, for X products will be multiplied by 6. Nothing could be, I would say, accurate to say that. As I said, forecast is always wrong. We start with this principle, but now bringing with the resources topic, I think the key main driver in this I would say winning situation was having the right people in place for 2 reasons. First, because we do have the right resources really connected with the business, understanding what's going on. So if the technologies are not there for that moment, right after the COVID explosion, we had the right connection with the business, understanding what was happening in the market, what was happening in terms of consumer behaviors change, and reacting quickly to that. If I could add one more thing, and this is somehow building on what David just mentioned about what somehow has changed, was about the alternative supplier strategy. So I think for all the industry we are playing, industries have a very, very strong pressure over price. But at this specific moment, when we are facing crisis, having the lowest price doesn't really matter if you don't have supply, right? So, and when we are facing this situation, having supply is critical, even if you're paying more. So there's another, I would say, paradigm that we were forced to change and saying, hey, let's start thinking about from one day to another, we may have restrictions on importing raw materials from India. Oh, by the way, India is the only source. The second one is China, also blocked. So just to bring some other examples of how to manage a different, I would say, a different way of guaranteeing the supply from now on.
So how do you do that? I mean, that sort of question of, because obviously you can't, there's only so much, so many suppliers that you can contract, or even sort of if you could contract sort of capacity, but that only gets you so far, and it only gets you so far as an individual company, because when you look at it from a systemic level, if everybody does that, if everybody does the same thing, the total number of suppliers of a particular thing in the world is at any one point is fixed. So everybody will be rushing to those suppliers, to tap that capacity, which they have contracted but didn't think they would, with the third supplier that isn't in India and in China. So how do you think about building in that sort of resilience in a way that doesn't break the system and doesn't break your bank?
Well, I think it's a matter of the long term. Nothing can be developed from one day to another, right? So you have a lot of regulatory constraints, a lot of restrictions to deal with, and quality standards to be fulfilled. So you need to start developing now and getting ready for the future. If hopefully another COVID will not come before we are ready for this second round of challenges. But if you don't start now, you're going to be completely, I would say, vulnerable for another heat like that.
Mike, I'd like to come back to you and ask about technology. What do you think, from your perspective, are the important technologies that really helped, supply chains survive this pandemic, and that more companies perhaps ought to be using, and what is coming along that would diminish disruption further, that you think is sort of not quite here yet, but is within reach? The question of the next couple of years.
Sure. So there's three that jump to mind for me, and the first is what I'd kind of call this control tower concept. I'd say historically supply chains were built around planning and then executing, right? Those are kind of the primary functions, right? You had this sort of, I build the plan, then I transact. I think, the folks who have invested in this ability to monitor and then adjust, right, to see where maybe problems are developing, to have a little bit of lead time to try to enact strategies, have done well. I'm guessing that a lot of folks on the phone in the consumer products industries are a little bit more robust in this capability. Certainly in some other industries, there probably hasn't been as much investment in this monitor and adjust capability. So this idea of a control tower where you have understanding of inventory, what's been committed by your suppliers, what's inbound in transit with accurate dates, what's within your four walls, what's outbound, what's maybe not committed but is outbound. Understanding this on a global basis. Companies who did this well, I think, got through the pandemic more effectively. And I think you'll see a lot of investment in this area of what I'll call control tower. The second area is what I would call hyper collaboration, right? And this is kind of, you can think of, a lot of us went through kind of COVID-19 war rooms, most of them virtual, where we were writing on the board, where are things at? Where can we move things? What changes can we make to try to shore up the plan, address capacity issues? A lot of that was done over, video conferencing technologies like this. I think more system-driven collaboration on forecast, capacity, kind of alternate bill of materials, PO commitments, ship dates, updates, that kind of systematizing that collaboration that helped us get through the last 14 months. I think that will be kind of a second area that will benefit a lot of folks. And the last area I would say would be planning. Planning requires, there are limitations, but I think, what we've seen is a greater incorporation of kind of external market trends, because we can't predict as well just with our internal data, and a more frequent revision of kind of how we forecast and also how we think about downstream constraints. If there's one thing I think we've all seen, is that those constraints further down the supply chain tended to cause more disruption than the capacity or the constraints within the four walls of our own enterprise. So I think you'll see, a fair amount of revision to planning approaches to try to make them more dynamic. And because I think we live in a more dynamic world, and the static planning approaches that we've had historically will not prove as effective.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on the collaboration point? Were you referring to collaboration within companies or between companies?
Both. I think, I think one of the positives that we will draw from the last 15 months, there's what I've seen is kind of a greater prevalence of a solve together mindset. Versus there's a primary partner who kind of dictates and then everyone else follows the plan. So I think that's both within companies in terms of how to address getting product to market, but certainly also across suppliers, contract manufacturers, your distribution partners. I think there's been a much greater emphasis on, hey, this is a challenge for all of us. We need to solve together, versus, well, I'm the person who ultimately owns demand, so you need to do it the way that I say.
David, I would like to ask you sort of a related question too, on the collaboration point, and that's, did Nestlé collaborate? I mean, obviously you need to collaborate within the sort of your supply chain vertically, downstream and upstream. But did you also collaborate horizontally with other companies? Because very often you will be sourcing from the same suppliers as some of your competitors. And was there some conversations between you? And if we certainly heard that this has happened in the pharmaceutical supply chain. There was a lot of collaboration on a lot of the development of the vaccines, for instance, and that's obviously quite interesting and heartening on one hand, but on the other, it immediately causes one to worry about possible collusion between and sort of cartelization. So I was wondering whether you had conversations with your rivals, and to what extent do you think that those conversations will persist within the sort of regulatory framework without falling foul of antitrust authorities?
Yeah, and I have to say, any conversation we would have had would have been strictly within the rules of any anti-competitive regulations. And in some, of course, it goes without saying. But in some markets, for example, the UK convened a cross-industry retailer, manufacturer, key supplier organisation to keep the country fed in their terms. So yes, that would be happening, but under the umbrella of an independent, honest broker in the process. So I don't think there'd be any suggestion that'd be anything untoward happening. I think there's some interesting stuff with some of our partners, for example, our logistics transportation partners, where, and in many ways they're operating across several companies. They're probably doing shipments for Dirk, shipments for Danny, shipments for ourselves at Nestlé. So that's interesting. Where do we have empty trailers equipment? And how do we get them in different parts of the country? So I think there's more scope to do perhaps some more of that on a more regular, coordinated basis, for sure. And also, you do have to deepen even more than we do the collaboration you do with your customers, because you may have to have some discussions about, clearly we're going to have shortages in category A or category B, which means we're going to have to do things differently in terms of the relationship and the ordering and so on. So did I answer your question? I'd like to say when we do need to coordinate as an industry, I think we have a good track record of doing that. We look at the GS1 Standards Organization and the Consumer Goods Forum. However, this is different when it's at an operational, transactional level. For me, that needs a different way of looking at it, where I think it's appropriate for a role like a coordinating government to say, okay, we'll get involved to make sure that the country's shelves are stocked, but there's no suggestion that there's any untoward, unethical, anti-competitive behaviour. Does that kind of help? I don't want to sound like we're not collaborating.
No, I think that makes sense.
In the right way.
Yeah. The point is that there was a lot of collaboration, then there was an expectation of collaboration on the part of consumers and governments. And I'm sort of wondering to what extent that will persist and how will it change beyond the pandemic, because it proved itself to be quite effective, but you have that slippery slope problem towards something that is a little bit less kosher.
Yeah, I want to open it to Danny and Dirk this, because let me say, I think we're on the start of especially around the collaboration, non-competitive collaboration. We're not competing on screen or on shelf. Will be a key part of how the supply chain contributes to our serious sustainability goals in the future. So I think there's going to have to be more of that. And I can imagine the way we worked during the pandemic could serve as a good model for having better utilization of our logistics assets and transport movements within a network, within a system type of thing. I could see that happening. Yeah.
Dirk, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think building on David's points, I think operationally short term is always the question: what is possible, of course, respecting compliance. And also, what is the matter of urgency behind? I think still, although shelves were empty, but CPG, FMCG industry was probably is hard to be compared with pharma when you really talk about vaccine development, where every day and week counts, and you're talking about imminent, life-threatening situations for let's say human beings. I think here that is still a different context, I have to say. And then, of course, what David said. Clear when it comes to, especially in the non-competitive area, collaboration like on logistics, even using same third-party logistics providers, optimizing deliveries to customers and so on. There are great examples out there, and I'm pretty sure that driven by sustainability that will rather intensify. But then, of course, this is nothing which you activate now in a crisis within 2 days. Yeah, so I think that we have to be realistic and clear also to differentiate a bit here.
And Danny, just your thoughts on that subject, since it would be interesting to hear from all three of you.
No, I'm quite aligned. I'm quite aligned with this one. There's one specific thing that I would like to add is how much the consumer behavior changing is coming back to us. We are talking about consumer goods companies. We are somehow in the backstage, right? So the consumers' behavior are changing. Just to add some examples or real data from the United States. So we are bringing the e-commerce from 14% pre-COVID to 25% today. So retailing in the US is moving up. It was a trend already, but it's moving extremely, extremely fast, right? So the question is, by when we're going to be at 50%, 50-50, 50% traditional in-store retailing versus e-commerce, right? So and the reaction that is completely going to our, I would say, side is traditional retailers were basically used to predetermine the demand, right, down to the store location, and then transmitting these to distributors, finally arriving at our hands. So we were like receiving this information and having to react based on that. Today is a completely different story if we think about e-commerce and all the platforms and all the technologies needed for that. So it's a different way to build a supply chain, is starting at the consumer and then working backward till the level of inventory we need to have at certain point, at certain location, and be ready when the consumer decide to buy. And this is going to be a complete game changer for us as well, the way we're gonna receive this input from the distributors, from the retailers, and how we're gonna work with this information and react on that. Right? So this is coming, and this was coming already, but this is way faster than anyone could predict.
So you mentioned earlier that the importance of having the right data on what is going on in your supply chain. Where are the data good, and which parts of the supply chain would require you to have a greater visibility? I mean, both downstream and upstream. Where do you see your biggest holes in the data that would enable you to really understand what is going on across the supply chain?
I would say demand planning, or any other, I would say, team that you may recognize as the closest point to the business. So this organization, very specialization, must be able to read, interpret, and react based on this data. That was something that I was always a little bit concerned about, getting access to 3, 4, 5 different platforms, different data, different projection, different aspects being considered. But the question for me is, do we have the right talents in place? Do we have the right people in place to interpret this data? That's always challenging for me. I think Mike has a question or a comment.
Yeah,
Mike?
I was just going to add to Danny's comment. I mean, certainly, I think one challenge is always where there's a change in traditional channels, right? So where maybe we went through that retail environment, but now we've got a different channel that's producing a lot of demand. There tends to be just poorer signals in terms of how to understand and forecast that demand. So that's certainly one area I'd see. A couple of other areas that I see with my telecom and high-tech clients are around they have long multi-echelon supply chains, right? Maybe 3 or 4 levels where you have components being produced and assembled into chassis and then being put into a backbone and a network. So they have many partners. The in transit, or kind of in between those different partners, the kind of when things are kind of moving from one to another, tends to create a lot of gray area, and that tends to be when they miss. It's because they don't understand those transitions from one enterprise to another. And I'd say the second other common miss area I see in my technology clients is they will have inventory, but it tends to disappear within the organization. So it may have been allocated to a program. It's not actually consumed, but from a financial standpoint, it is sort of already owned by someone. So it's not available for a reallocation or repurposing. So I've seen a lot of focus amongst my clients of, we need to create more kind of fungibility and make sure that we're not pre-committing inventory where it's not going to be deployed effectively, and make sure that we're always making that decision about this asset or this piece of inventory will create the most value for the enterprise if we put it here. And there's a fair amount of process and technology work that needs to happen to create that visibility.
So how much visibility do you have? I'm thinking about the three representatives of firms, of companies. How much visibility do you have beyond your sort of tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, David?
It depends. We have some, let's consider key categories, which we monitor quite carefully and sensitively, both because they're sensitive for our business, make sure we have the right supply, the right amount of supply, and also because we take our commitments to transparency for our consumers seriously as well. So I'd say in some areas we have good visibility, always improving, and we are looking at opportunities around new technologies. We've tested out some blockchain things as well in that space. So yes, I feel like we've made good progress there, and we will continue to make progress there. I think often we touched upon earlier, the further you get away and the higher you go up the tiers, the more challenging it is to get accurate and timely information as well. That's the other key thing. It's a combination of both. So not perfect, but we've put a lot of work in over the past 10 years at least on making sure we have the key parts in place for those critical categories for us.
Danny, where would you like to see more? Then where would you like to have more visibility over your supply chain?
I think the answer is in both directions, not only from the consumer point of view, but also from the supply point of view. So and ending up in the center. So today we were receiving a lot of different inputs from the market and trying to react the best way. But then we faced a very, very serious constraint from the material supply point of view. So I think sometimes we're extremely concerned and focused in trying to get the demand, but forgetting about the other side of the coin, that we can be very good in getting this information. But if you're not prepared to supply, it doesn't really matter, right? So I would say both directions.
And Dirk, did you find any blind spots that you thought were sort of particularly needed at addressing?
Of course, you always have blind spots. No, but I think building on what was said, downstream, it's not perfect. Yeah, it depends a bit on the country, geography, customer, and so on. Upstream, tier 1, tier 2, as you said, not really an issue. Usually when we go beyond tier 1, tier 2, for us, we are talking about non-discrete materials. So it's, let's say, bulk chemicals, paper, and other things. And here, let's say it is less a monitoring really on, let's say, on item or material level, more looking into capacities, how they develop and how they are impacted. Most recent example, polar vortex in the US, of course, hitting the base chemical industry in North America quite heavily. So here, that is the way how we can tackle it and reasonably tackle. So from that point of view, it can always be more. What we observe very recently is the number of supply disruptions. So first of all, in 2020, I personally would have expected for our business more upstream disruption than what we saw. But now in quarter one, it's for us, it's crazy as a company. So we see a factor, let's say 4. We have had, let's say in quarter one, the same number of supply challenges on a company level than when we had what we had the entire last year. So that is not easy. Again, it's just a pure count. Of course, it depends also on the size of the event and an end. But it's at the moment, at least, we see a couple of additional incremental external events like Suez, weather, and so on. Hurricane season is coming in combination with, I would call it the biggest bullwhip experiment we have seen so far in mankind, the aftermath of COVID-19, which containers and other things that will take still a couple of quarters until that normalizes. But of course, you have again a couple of, let's say, more regional external events, putting additional pressure to the system, onto a system which is already quite stressed. So let's say what we are surprised is the not only the number of events, but also how fast they come up. And David, you said it, you're only 10 days away from Stone Age. So I think these kind of moments we will continue to have more still, so it will not get boring.
So I would like to turn away from sort of the technology and go back to a point that all of you have made, and that is to have the right people. How do you get the right people? I mean, traditionally, the supply chain job, within a company was probably not the sexiest, I dare say. Although obviously, you three, I'm sure are extremely well liked and regarded and have been for many years. But it does seem like this part of a business has become much more prominent in the past year. There's certainly been, we've written a lot more about supply chains in the past year than we had in the past. I think most other publications have. Politicians have talked about it a lot more than in the past. It seems that it is on, it is certainly on the agenda, as I said in my introduction. So has it become easier to recruit clever people? And how do you go about recruiting the right people, which all of you have stressed is absolutely mission critical? David?
It's too early to tell if we recruited the right people yet. I just want to make a comment about supply chain's innate sexiness, which of course we all would approve of on this call. However, I think there has been a step change. When I joined, it wasn't even called supply chain then, it was that long ago, 100 years ago, the industry, it was like, okay, what a strange thing to do. Now I do get a sense of there's a real purpose about the supply chain. And I think both we as supply chain professionals and the communications industry needs to talking about the purpose. The supply chain will help us solve some really big problems globally. Okay? It's not the panacea to everything. Don't misunderstand me. We're not the Avengers of the supply chain, but we can do a lot in terms of improving our sustainability. We can do a lot in terms of improving our the lives that people lead up and down our supply chain. So, and I think sometimes we have to tell a better story as well, both as individuals, organizations, and as the profession of the supply chain. So multifaceted things we need to do. We should also, and I know the three companies here because I see it in the news, make big steps in terms of diversity and inclusion across the supply chain. And that will help us bring a new wave of talent into it. The other thing I would say, I don't think consumer packaged goods businesses, and this is the final thing, are penalized. However, there are lots of other interesting digital online type businesses that perhaps our high performing graduates are more interested in joining. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. But come and join the supply chain. It's never boring, that's for sure.
I mean, so when you think about it, it is like the backbone of the global economy in the sense that it holds everything up. Mike, I saw you wanted to chip in on the talent question.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say traditionally, if we think about supply chain, there's been kind of maybe a single objective function, efficiency, right? That's kind of been what we've all been pointed to as supply chain professionals. I think, increasingly, and I'm seeing companies do this, is really balancing that mission. Efficiency is important, but second is resilience, sustainability, diversity, right? Managing that, how do we adjust and adapt and flex, right? So that's the second pillar. And I'd say the third is innovation. In so many of our businesses, the innovation comes from the supply base, right? So certainly in with the technology companies that I'm working with, you could think of them assembling the great stuff that's happening out there in the market and putting it together in new configurations to develop new products. So I think positioning that sort of balanced mission of efficiency, resilience, and sustainability, and innovation as sort of the charter for supply chain professionals, I think it makes it a much more attractive field, and I think will help continue to elevate the mission.
Dirk, you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, absolutely. So building on Mike's point, I think the discipline as such is relatively young. So the terminology, and I think when people spoke about supply chain a decade or two ago, they thought about logistics more or less, or maybe planning. I think what we see, of course, the scope is getting larger. Today, we talk about end-to-end, really from customer service, demand planning, manufacturing, to delivery, engineering, what you name it. So that is one thing. Then, as Mike said, the parameters we are measured. At the end of the day, we are talking about processes or network of processes, so measured by KPIs. is also getting more complex, and you need to find the right balance. And I think that makes it interesting. And I see also when I look at people interested in the function, also a certain polarization. Some say, "Wow, I really would like to join." Others say, "Woo, that is getting probably already too challenging and too complex." So, because at the end of the day, I like to say we are a GEP function. Either you are at zero accidents, zero emissions, or whatever, and you, by definition, you will have a hard time to get there, or you want to get to 100, means 100% fill rate on time and so on, which is also not very realistic. So you have to have also people in such a team who are able, resilient as such already as personalities, have the right mindset. Otherwise, you would get relatively quickly frustrated. So from that point of view, you need to love the uncertainty. And I think that applies more than ever. And be able to handle very complex topics with a good mix between bias towards action and also from time to time make a step back and develop great plans.
So I was actually going to ask Danny the question that you led into, and that is, how do you screen for a good supply chain manager? What do you look for in a candidate?
No, that's the most favorite topic always. And adding to your question and how to make it sexy, right? And to the right candidates, the top talents. For sure, supply chain is not just to be the person or the resource moving boxes around. If that's the case, you're not going to be able to bring the right talents. It must be the resource, the team, the leaders driving the business along with the business leaders. That's for me the way of differentiating who's going to win, who's going to lose. Supply chain, as Dirk mentioned, it's way more complex and involving other areas and more than just being someone supporting the business. So that's for me the biggest thing. The second, going to your first question, how to be attractive enough, you need to give the empowerment to the resources you're hiring. If you're mentioning a manager, a leader, and saying you're gonna come not only to be efficient, you're gonna come to learn, to listen, and then after experiencing a little bit, you're gonna be as knowledgeable, as an expert, as a sales rep, being able to contribute with business decisions, but with one benefit on top, because you're gonna bring all the operational background with you. So it's someone not just giving a personal opinion, it's someone really helping to the business decision, final decision, and saying, okay, on top of everything else that I can contribute with, this comes the operational consequences of this or that decision. And that would be a complete game changer in saying to this potential candidate, saying, you're going to come not only to contribute, you're going to come to drive the business. And this is something completely different from what we are, I would say, familiarized with.
Well, that was all really fascinating. Unfortunately, we've basically run out of time, but this is, I think, a good moment to end on in a way, because A, it's sort of optimistic, and also second, it sort of casts us forward. And I began this panel by asking how to look back 10 years and compare it to today. And from what I heard from all of you is that if we asked that same question, it is almost certain in 10 years' time, it is almost certain that the world will be in a better place in 10 years' time because of the coming technologies, because of the realization of just how critical good, solid, resilient management of supply chains is, and because of the attractiveness of the role within corporate structures that enables you to have your pick of the brightest and best to manage this backbone of the global economy. So I would like to thank all of you for a very, very interesting discussion, and I would like to thank the audience for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you, everyone.